First came the countdown. 3, 2, 1. The scene went blank, and then came a flash of light as the camera switched on. Now Diedrich was looking at the interior of a very large, expensive house. He scanned the scene for any sign of where it might be located, but there was none. He was looking at a dining room that looked as if it had just been the epicenter of some great party. There were wine bottles and food scattered around on a long table, lit with burning nubs of white candles which had dripped wax down onto the oak wood. The cameraman was walking along to a door, which he opened before descending down a staircase into a cellar. There was a light from the bottom of the stairs, and the walls were of stone. Diedrich made note that the house must be very old. Diedrich felt cold and anxious as he saw shapes moving in the center of the chamber, and his hands began to shake nervously when he saw that they were the slow, shuffling forms of what could only be animated corpses, wandering aimlessly from one side of the room to the other, like patients in the day room of a sanitarium. The camera turned to the stairs to reveal the familiar faces of Drescher's group as they walked down the steps, laughing and inebriated. Diedrich took 2 pills from the prescription bottle and chewed them before washing them down with strong black coffee. In a few moments, his tension began to relax as he watched the living as they mocked and prodded the dead. The animated corpses did not retaliate and seemed mere automatons incapable of thought and reaction as they were slapped and pushed. Diedrich could not conceive of a mentality which would indulge in such ridiculous cruelty for pleasure. These people were like dumb, angry children who delighted in the power they held over the stiff, robotic cadavers. One of them had taken a sword from a corner of the table and was engaging in an inane duel with one of the corpses. He would pose as if on guard, then lunge and stab at the zombie with zeal. Another was wielding a cricket bat and was bashing at the head of another corpse, which seemed to entertain the others greatly. The camera moved to a table against the wall, on which a wide variety of drug paraphernalia was strewn beneath a low burning oil lamp. There were syringes and spoons beside a mirror covered in numerous lines of long white powder. There were unfolded pieces of aluminum foil on which there were tabs of LSD and piles of heroin. It occurred to Diedrich that it was a small wonder that members of the group had lived to such a ripe old age after such rampant and dangerous abuse of drugs. These people had been little more than degenerate animals who had been given the key to some ability to tamper with the powerful forces of life and death. Diedrich now realized, as members of the group began to disrobe, that Emmerich had not yet made an appearance on film. It seemed satisfactory for him to merely watch as the others debased themselves and desecrated the dead. He was the unseen host, watching and devouring the evil which he inspired. Diedrich turned off the projector before the truly hideous actions of the party began. He would not subject himself to that horror, no matter what clue he may find. As he reached for another reel, his phone rang, and he nearly leapt to the ceiling with surprise. It hadn't been but a few hours since he had called London, and as he lifted the receiver, he wondered if Inspector White could have found something so soon. However, it was a woman's voice on the other end. It was Agnes. "Diedrich, I just got a call from the station," she said nervously. "I told them I would call you because I somehow can't help but feel responsible." "What's wrong, Agnes?" he said, his voice wavering as he tried to quiet his trembling nerves. "Something happened last night in the morgue after I left. It just seems impossible." "I know that I locked up." "Calm down. Tell me what happened," he said with sudden interest. "Diedrich, somehow someone got into the examination room and took the bodies of the elderly missing persons out of the cooler. They dragged them all out and adjusted the thermostat until the room was over 80 degrees. "My God," Diedrich blurted as he almost fell over the couch with shock. "That's not all. Whoever did this dismembered and mutilated all the bodies with my surgical saw. The officer I spoke to said that they were decapitated and their organs strewn about the room so that you couldn't even tell whose was whose. It's impossible. How could anyone have gotten in? The only body that wasn't touched was Katja Drescher's. It's okay, Agnes. This wasn't your fault. What did the officers do with the bodies? I told them to turn down the room temperature and leave everything where they had found it, but whoever did this poured the parasitic acid I used for sterilizing all over the corpses. It's not the strongest corrosive, but it already began to deteriorate the bodies. They must have lain like that all night. Diedrich held the receiver with a shaking hand as his heart beat rampantly in his ears. He felt weak and afraid, but at the same time a certain sense of justice was calming him from the pit of his stomach. There's nothing that we can do right now, Agnes. Just remember that this wasn't your fault. There are things at work here which we cannot understand. Don't be so enigmatic. You know I hate that. You know something about this, don't you? Maybe, but nowhere near enough to be able to explain. We will talk sometime, I promise. I really wish you would start talking now, Dieter. I only wish I could, Agnes. He heard her sigh and hang up. He looked around the room, half expecting to see Petra Strauss standing with a triumphant smile, but the apartment was still empty. He went back, set up the projector, and prepared to watch the fourth film. Another daylight scene, but from the foreboding dark clouds which hung suspended over the trees in the distance, it seemed a storm was coming over the house. He could see it clearly as the cameraman, Drescher, was filming it with pride. The house was large and well made, but not so stately as to stand out from the countryside. It appeared to be well kept, but signs of age and recent negligence foretold that by now it may lie in ruin. It was surrounded by a high brick wall which was overgrown with vines, and by the looks of the forest beyond this wall the house would be far from a town or rural neighborhood. The scene flashed, and once more Diedrich was looking at the inside of a parlor where the guests lay naked and unconscious in sullen heaps on the floor. The room was a catastrophe of scattered bodies, bottles, books, and clothing, as if a bomb had exploded in the chamber's center. Diedrich grew frozen as gooseflesh rose on his arms. It was now storming outside the house, and in the flashes of lightning he detected the hazy white form of a woman appearing in the doorway. With every flash of lightning which lit the room, the specter grew nearer to the camera. Diedrich jumped when, in the last burst of luminescence, he saw that she stood but a few paces from the lens, staring with unbridled hatred at he who held the camera. It was Petra. Even though there was no sound to indicate what was occurring, Diedrich held the distinct impression that Emmerich was speaking to the ghost. Diedrich forced himself to clear his mind, and once more, as he had done at the station, he let the deep focus of his will center upon the scene before him. Hear their words, he told himself. Then, just as before, he was beset by a growing feverish warmth and ache in his bones as his mind separated itself from his body. "Set me free, Emmerich," she said with cold rage. "Never, you foolish whore. You will learn who is the master of your fate," he answered. "How long do you think this evil can last before it destroys you?" "I am the evil, Petra. Haven't you realized that by now? You're just a sick child playing God is all you are, and in time, your game will end." "I will never end, Petra. I know the way now. I can go for as long as I can find a vessel to carry me. Now, begone to the shadows. I grow weary of your complaints." As Diedrich watched, she vanished like a flame snuffed by the snap of Emmerich's fingers. But now, Diedrich was no longer just watching the film. Now, he was there, in the room, looking out through Emmerich's eyes. He was looking, with all his egoism and arrogance, at the painting of a child which hung on the wall. It was then that Diedrich knew. there was a safe behind the portrait, and within that safe, there was kept the quartz crystal amulets. Diedrich began searching and pulling at the dim scene as he desperately tried to find one word, one hint of where the house was located. Out of the darkness and moving images, he could see only one word clearly: Necropolis. He was snapped from the vision by the clicking of the reel as the film ended. He stood elated and energized with the revelation of what he had just done. The aching was gone now and was replaced by a tremendous sense of empowerment. He relit his grandfather's pipe and began pacing back and forth across the room. If he could find that house, he was certain he could locate Drescher and his group, and if Petra had been correct, they would no longer be in any condition to roam freely amongst the living populace. With their original bodies destroyed, they would begin decaying at an inordinate rate and would be seeking other hosts. But that was in England, and he was trapped here in this infernal blizzard. He was filled with anger as he contemplated his next course of action. Could he dare ask White to investigate? By involving his old friend, he would be putting him at great risk, and there was no way that Peter would believe any of what Diedrich could tell him. He would have to lie, and thereby be sending an unwilling innocent against a group of undead monsters holed up in their ruined lair. However, if he waited, then the group could escape and continue to extend the horrible list of atrocities which already ran the full length of a volume. He puffed on his pipe in frustration. What about Petra? Was there anything that she could do? If it was in fact her who had entered the corpse of Katja in order to destroy the bodies of Emmerich's group, then could she do the same if such a vessel existed in the house in England? Diedrich gazed about the room and called out, "Petra, are you here? Can you come to me? I need to speak with you now." But there was no response. Diedrich threw himself down onto the couch and stared intently at the makeshift movie screen on the wall. He felt more helpless and restrained than all his years working as a police officer. It occurred to him that this must be how psychics feel when they stumble across information with which they had no ability to use in a world full of non-believers. Then just as he began to reach for the pill bottle, the phone rang. "Yes," he said quickly with urgent, desperate hope. "Dieter," answered a familiar voice with a light British accent. "Peter, I was just thinking of you," he said, trying to sound calm and normal. "Well, I was looking around for that information you were inquiring about this morning, and I think I may have found something." "Yes, good. What did you find?" "Well, it seems that right around the time you were talking about, there was a great many disturbances reported by the groundskeepers at Brookwood. And does this cemetery match the description I gave you?" "Oh yes, quite. It's been around since the 1800s, and it's bloody huge. They used to call it the Old London Necropolis." The last word hit Diedrich like a falling stone dropped from the sky. "Listen, Peter, I need to know if there are any old houses in the area." "Here we go again. Give me more, Dieter." "It would be large, with a second story, and there would be a great stone wall around it. It would be very isolated, but situated close to the cemetery. At the time of the disturbances, it would be owned by Emmerich Drescher, or maybe someone else, possibly under an assumed name. If anyone bought it after the 70s, it would be almost unlivable, and one more thing. It would have a large cellar." "Okay, just hold on a moment while I pull up a map of that area. Okay, the cemetery is in Surrey, near the town of Brookwood. From what I can see, there's only one house out there, located near the Basingstoke Canal. At the time, there wouldn't have been anyone out there residentially, but I believe there is a path running to the cemetery. Is any of this of use?" "Tremendously," Diedrich said with wonder as he tried to work out some plan of action. "Look, Dieter, if this is really important, I can send someone out to have a look." "No. I mean, it is important, but I need to go there myself. Looks like you're in a spot. I don't think anyone's flying out of Berlin right now. Dieter, if this is really something big, I can go myself. No, please, Peter. This could be very dangerous. I can't really explain, but I think something could be going on out there. I hate to be blunt, Dieter, but I am a policeman, and if there's anything going on related to those murders, I really need to know. Just wait, Peter, and I'll see if I can give you anything more. Please, just don't do anything right now. You really put me in a bind here, Dieter. You call me up and ask for help when you tell me not to do anything. You sound a bit unhinged. I know I sound like a lunatic. I'm causing you a great amount of inconvenience, but you have to believe that it is for the better good. You're sounding like a martyr here, Dieter. Why don't you just relax and enjoy your time off? I'll see if anything turns up on this end. Diedrich was about to protest when he heard the line go dead. He sat still and filled with a horrible fear that he may have already put another's life at stake unwittingly. He began once more to pace the room and puff unrelentingly on his grandfather's pipe. He would never be able to forgive himself if anything happened to such an old and trusted colleague as Peter. But he knew deep down that a cop like Inspector White was never one to back down from a case. Peter White was like a hound when it came to criminology, and would never back down from a trail once he had gotten the scent. "You're a damn fool, Diedrich," he shouted at himself as he stared out the window and into the falling wall of white which raged outside. He could only hope that maybe fate was watching out for his friend. He clenched his fists and closed his eyes as he wondered, with confused, nervous vulnerability, where was the ghost of Petra Strauss now? Emmerich Drescher was born in the small town of Liebberg, Germany, in August of 1931. He was only a small child when Adolf Hitler rose to power with the promise of a new and better Germany that would last 1,000 years. His father despised Hitler and voted against him in his run for the presidency. They counted themselves fortunate when Hitler lost, and cursed the day he managed to climb into power nonetheless. They watched as their country seemingly flourished under the new regime, but always his father warned that the day would come when they would regret ever having even heard the name of Adolf Hitler. The Third Reich's extermination of the Jews and other targeted minorities was a sickening boil on the souls of the German people, according to Emmerich's father. Despite the protests and threats from Emmerich's mother, he continued to aid their Jewish neighbors in fleeing the country and escaping the eventual attempted genocide. However, by luck and the protecting hand of God, his secret alliances were never discovered, and they remained free German citizens until the war's end. And that was when the Allies came. The Allied forces marched through Germany and began a systematic roundup of those who had not been killed in bombings or by their own hands, and began marching them towards the ruins of Berlin. Emmerich was only 9 years old when he watched his parents and siblings gathered into groups and forced to march for days on foot to the city, which would become their prison. One of Emmerich's clearest memories was of pleading with an American soldier that they were not Nazis and had helped many Jewish families to escape. The soldier had shaken his head with disgust and gestured for him to join the group with sorrowful, angry eyes. His father had lifted him up and said, "They will never believe us, Emmerich. We will pay for the crimes of all of German people now." This one simple explanation had been all his father would ever say to justify the long, horrible years that they would spend struggling in the wreckage of Berlin. His father would die within 2 years, and their mother would become almost insane with grief and loss soon after. Emmerich would raise himself on the streets begging and stealing until he could one day leave the city on his own. The events which would mold his life thereafter were a never-ending barrage of crimes and beatings as he struggled and fought his way out of the city. He would for a time become the resident of a Catholic orphanage where it would be noticed that he could read and write. Here, his talent for language would be nurtured as he was given books to read and study. He would find a book of poetry by a Frenchman named Paul Fournier called L'Apocalypse et la Roi des Rats, and this would spawn a love of poetry, which would eventually lead him to fame. However, during all those long years of reaching and clawing and fighting his way through life, Emmerich had kept a secret that he would not share until far into his adulthood. Emmerich was seeing the dead, and once he had seen something more. He had seen the ghosts of soldiers wandering the battlefields, morose and foreboding as he and his family were marched to Berlin. He had seen the mournful and lost spirits of men, women, and children in the city wandering amidst the rubble and carnage. He had witnessed the crying and pleading of spirits hovering over their own bodies in the sick houses and streets, but he never spoke of what he saw, and no one would ever know what conclusion the boy had come to in his own mind about the visions which he received but through the coded lines of his poetry. The boy is a fragile glass through which the dead can see. The boy is a filter of despair and misery. Broken filament and deranged senses say, crawling lifeless through the rubble of another shattered day. The poetry would become a cryptic journal of Emmerich's slow downward spiral into depravity, but it would be read only as metaphor by those who studied it. On becoming a young man, he would escape to England, where he began to work as a letter boy at a newspaper in London. Eventually, he would begin writing articles for the same publication, and in time was considered an aspiring journalist. In secret, he continued his search for some answer as to how and why he perceived the spirits of the deceased. His research into the occult would at long last bring him into contact with a book of interviews with a long-forgotten Russian medium named Arkhip Zulkin. And through this book, he would learn of another even more obscure and lost tome entitled The Book of the Skull, written by another Russian mystic named Afanasy Maskadov. Emmerich would search in vain for a full copy of the infamous work, but to no avail. He would only find fragments and detached translations left by those few who had studied it, but from these he would at last gather the information which would allow him to begin the process of using his strange gifts. Just as he was beginning his experimentation with interaction with the ghosts he could see, his first volume of poetry would be published, and he would become known all over Europe. Now, he would not only have the knowledge to begin his dabbling with the power of the other world, but he would have the money and time with which to fully indulge his obsession. Why God had saw it fit to bestow such power on such a cold and compassionless soul as he would remain a mystery, even to himself. A more altruistic being may well have sought to use his gifts to free the burdened souls of the dead, but Emmerich sought only to use and manipulate the fringe forces that separate the living from those who had passed beyond the mortal coil. Emmerich's mind was a twisted and corrupt prison, through which all things natural and bright were deformed and misused for the entertainment of his dark and wretched being. He began by killing, and then examining the spirit of the person who he had slain. He had learned that by means of certain rituals and chants, he could control the ghost and use it for all manner of diversions. This would prove a minor feat in light of his next ambition, the reanimation of dead human flesh. As a young journalist, he traveled to India, China, and eventually Korea, and used these occasions to practice this technique in back alleys and battlefields. But the one key goal which he had sought from the beginning would elude him until he would meet others of a similar interest: how to project the soul back into the flesh. It would be his poetry which would first draw the attention of those who would in time become members of his secret inner circle. There were those scattered across Europe who had begun to decipher the messages of his work and sought him out to form a central group of those sharing his ambitions and proclivities. However, it is doubtful that they truly knew the dark and unnatural inclinations of the young poet upon their initial urge to seek him. It would only be over the scattering of years, as they were exposed to the manipulations and deceptions of Drescher, that they would become corrupted by his will. He would become the doorman at the gates of hell, and would welcome them into a morbid and diseased world of the most abhorrent activities. All this would remain a secret, however, from the world at large, and Drescher would continue in his experiments now with the aid of 6 accomplices. If they had known that to him they were only puppets, used to delight and entertain his whims, perhaps they would have fled his presence, never to return. But Drescher presented himself to them as an all-knowing and private messiah who had mastered the forces of life and death with his will. In time, they would be lost in his vast and inescapable dominion of darkness. It had been Drescher's long-standing habit to always keep a girl at his side. There was always some youthful and pretty admirer with him to attend readings and public events. It should have been noticed when these girls disappeared and were never heard from again by their families and peers. However, Drescher had become adept at choosing the most isolated and remote of individuals with whom to associate, and their absence would never be noted other than as a footnote on some police report. Petra Strauss had been different. In his middle age, Emmerich had become convinced that he should marry, and thereby deflect attention from his other, increasingly deranged occupations. When he stumbled across the already jaded and despairing Petra, he felt that he had come across the perfect candidate. He gave her a pristine illusion, and was enraged beyond madness when she betrayed it. Her punishment was as fitting and just as his deranged intellect could conjure. He made her a pawn in his never-ending game, and watched with delight as she was abused and made an object of his group's amusement. If he had known the degree by which he had underestimated her cunning and power, that he might never have kept her spirit so long, so close. His next victim of matrimony was the timid and much less complex Katja, who he had chosen specifically because of her seemingly passive nature. Once more, however, he would find that his perception of her far underscored a hidden and sharp intellect, which would eventually lead to his undoing. Katja had not been so blatant in her defiance of his will, and had acted in conspiracy with Petra to overthrow his hold on their lives and afterlives. Emmerich would vow that never again would he allow himself to be taken off guard by a female. He and his followers' return to England was meant to be a grand renewal of their youth. Here they would revel in their pleasures as never before, but all these plans and desires were shattered within days of their return to the dark house near Brookwood. They had spent the evening wallowing in filth and wanton lechery of drugs, sex, and alcohol, only to awaken the following morning to a horrible and bleak surprise. Their new, beautiful young bodies were already progressing into an advanced stage of decay. Panic and hysteria had set in amongst their ranks immediately, and the fighting and bickering had led Emmerich into an unsurpassed rage. They fell back into silent terror as he gazed at them with seething, violent rage over the table where the night before they had attempted to reclaim the vitality and passion of youth, but failed. There had been signs ever since the first of the transference rituals were carried out that all was not going to be as they had hoped. Their new bodies, although young in appearance, did not react or feel as natural living bodies should. They found their senses dulled and their perceptions muted. The one feeling that was acute and ever-present was an ongoing and lingering cold, which could not be warmed by any natural means. The drugs, which they had so longed for in their old age, had no effect on the deadened receptors of their blunted nervous systems. There was no warmth in the wine, and no light in the stimulants. Food was tasteless and bland, and no desire could burn in the loins of their youthful, dead hosts. As there was no pleasure, there was also no pain. They had, it seemed, condemned themselves into a state of ongoing, frigid numbness. The first night of their return to the house had been a dreary reenactment of the times of the past. But no matter how much they drank, or how many substances they injected, there were no pleasurable bursts of euphoria or escape. All too soon the complaining had begun, and by morning, with the unexpected onset of decay, the group fell into terror. The worst had been Jaina, as she howled and demanded that Emmerich do something to reverse the sudden peeling of flesh from her face and the foul, rotting odor of her body. He had responded by standing from the table, withdrawing a Ruger from his coat, and firing 3 small rounds directly into her forehead. The others had sat in stunned silence as she fell back, slumped in her chair, with small streams of blood trickling down like tears over her blank, staring eyes. They had all glanced nervously at one another with the knowledge that she was still trapped within the corpse, with a now damaged and unusable brain. Emmerich had seated himself and calmly placed the gun on the table beside him as he ran his hand through the slick blonde hair of his host body, only to find several strands sticking in a clump to his fingers. He had shaken the detached hairs to the floor and wiped his hand on his sleeve as he gazed coldly at Jaina's corpse. Adalbert, who had always been closest to Jaina, looked at Emmerich with young eyes which held all the despair of an elderly man. "Please, Emmerich," he had whispered with an anxious, pleading tone, "don't leave her like that. Call her back to the crystal. We will find another host." "Hush, Adalbert," Emmerich replied coolly. "I rather like her like this. She is so much more agreeable." They sat in silence as they finally arrived at the long-denied truth that they were all at the mercy of Emmerich's will. How could they have believed that he held them in any regard other than servants or slaves? They had fallen prey to one of the oldest failings of the human heart, that when desires are met and pleasures attained, it will not question the means, source, or design of delight and diversion. The soul will close the window to the future and ignore what tidings of tragedy there may lay in what is yet to come, and will not haggle the price of a present filled with immediate satisfaction. Life, death, and the entire world were all but objects of amusement and experimentation to one such as Emmerich Drescher. How could they have believed that they were an exception? They had watched him betray those who loved and trusted him the most, his wives, his children, and mocked the foolishness of the ignorant women as he degraded and punished them in life and afterlife. They had thought themselves better and somehow cherished beyond these mundane and boring brides. Now here they were, at the brink of plummeting into the same abyss which he had flung countless loves over the course of his degenerate existence. They now looked on at each other and glanced at the body slumped in the chair at the end of the table, knowing that they were not exempt. They had first met Emmerich Drescher at the Belshire Folk Festival in early 1961. They had all been young college students then, united by their own joint interests in parapsychology, free love, and drugs. The festival was a small camp of tents and booths nestled safely in the wooded valley of Griffeld, some 2 miles from the town of Belshire. The young students that attended had not yet made a complete transition over into the coming hippie craze, but all the telltale seeds of the coming movement were evident. In Britain, the conservative movement was falling into disrepute, and a sudden slide to the political left was on the horizon. America had entered confrontations in both Cuba and Vietnam, while a wall was being built in Berlin to divide the city into 2 factions. However, for the 6 students meeting in the warm green valley amongst the bonfires, campers, and tents, there was only the blissful freedom of the moment, and the fears of the future were distant and vague. Adalbert and Jana had become familiar with the writings of Emmerich Drescher during their stay at the London University, where he was then lecturing. Through their correspondence with Alan, Frida, and Merle, and Darius, they had communicated their fascination with the infamous poet and journalist. They had invited their friends to journey to the festival in order to meet the man they considered a pioneer and savant in person. The 6 young students had met each other only a year before during the brief, ill-fated psychic research trials in France under Professor Jean Giraud. They had attended testing for various psychic faculties in order to further Gerald's research before his grant was revoked the following summer. The 6 had stayed in contact through letters and phone calls, with their meeting in Belshire as a long-awaited reunion. The first day of the festival had passed in a haze of music, celebration, and LSD. Drescher had not yet arrived, and their conversation was filled with questions and analysis of his poetry, which they had theorized was most certainly psychically inspired. Word passed among the attendees that Drescher had arrived in the night and would be giving his first readings at the bank of a stream near the encampment at dusk the following evening. They had awaited in his presence beneath the heavy green branches of the summer oaks and were lost in a dream world of intoxication by the time he made his first appearance. He had stepped into the sunlight from within his tent, wearing a loose white silk shirt and brown trousers. His blonde, gray-streaked hair profuse and ear-length over a handsome, roguish face. He held all the mystical bohemian appeal of a poet from some lost era in time. He had waved to the group of some 20 youths who sat on blankets by the small waterfall and opened a bottle of wine, which he drank from like some ghost of Shelley. There was soft applause and calls of welcome from the group as he sat down on a stone and removed a notebook from his hip pocket. As he started to read, his voice strong, melodic, and compelling, they immediately fell under the sway of his hypnotic and subtle spell. The 6 knew as they listened that he was indeed speaking a secret language of mystical experience that the others could not understand on the deep and meaningful level which they could. He was writing in the hidden language of the unconscious, and only they could determine its true enigmatic revelation. Afterwards, they had approached him and, like doting, eager children, lavished him with praise and flattery. He chided them with modest reproach and allowed them to accompany him as he walked amongst the booths and regaled them with stories of his travels and insights. They were in the company of an older, experienced man who disregarded all social mores with a swift and cutting disposition of the modern world. His genius drew them in, and his dark and brooding intellect kept them bound. Later in the dark hours of morning, he began to confess that he did indeed know of the mysteries to which they had alluded throughout the day. He confirmed their fondest hopes that he was, in fact, the bearer of the same abilities to which they themselves were possessed. And then, to their unhindered rapture, he offered to tell them more, and so began their following and worship of Emmerich Drescher. From a bright and beautiful morning in the warm natural light of a newly risen sun to a dark and cold ruined house decaying in the cold of winter, their journey was now complete. Look, sir, this is a matter of police business, and if you refuse to divulge any information which may be of use, you can be charged with withholding evidence, Inspector White said with mounting frustration to the ridiculously condescending young man with whom he was now speaking to on the phone. Inspector, I'm trying to tell you that there would be no way for me to tell you who owned the house back then, even if it wasn't confidential. The young man's facade of politeness was wearing White down to his last nerve. My father had been dead for 10 years now, and I have no idea where that information might have been kept. He died in a retirement home, and my sister took care of all his business affairs. Well, where can I reach her then? White said as he held his pen sternly over the yellow notepad on his desk. It was now 5 o'clock in the evening, and his wife had just appeared at his study door for the second time to call him to dinner. She lives in Sydney. Sydney, Australia? White could almost hear the man rolling his eyes over the line. Yes, look, this is what I'll do. I'll call her tomorrow morning and see if she still has my dad's records tucked away somewhere. But I really think you're barking up the wrong tree. Why don't you just search the address and see what name comes up? I did search the bloody address, and your father was the last listed owner in 1965. Yes, Inspector, but he sold it. I know he sold it, but to who? I'll call you tomorrow. There was a sudden click, and the call was over. White slammed the phone down and stared out the window as he took a deep breath and attempted to calm himself before his blood pressure reached a critical high. His wife appeared again, looking as irritated and disappointed as ever. I told you I was coming, he said as he stood and smashed his cigarette out in the ashtray by the computer. You told me that an hour ago, Peter, but what have I told you about bringing your damn cases home? She had large, beautiful brown eyes, but they were now stern with impatience. It's not my case. It's Dita's, he answered, as he followed her down the hallway. As they entered the kitchen, he saw that the children were already half finished with their roasted potatoes. So now you're working for the Berlin police as well, she said sarcastically as she sat down and thumped Michelle on the head for making faces at her baby brother. It's all about those missing persons they had this year. He poured himself a glass of wine as he sat down and popped a cold roast potato in his mouth. What about them? She sighed, resolving herself to the inevitable police work conversation, which seemed all but imminent. Well, it turned into quite the situation, apparently. It seems that half of them turned up dead. This drew the attention of his daughter, who looked up with wide, interested eyes. Were they murdered? The 10-year-old asked with ominous, fascinated expression. No, it seems they all committed suicide, he answered before he realized his wife was gazing at him with cool, reproachful anger. But besides that, he quickly continued, one of them was Emmerich Drescher. This brought a look of recognition and interest from his wife as well. You mean the poet Emmerich Drescher, she said, leaning forward and placing her glass in her hand thoughtfully. The one and only, he said, relieved that something had shifted her attention away from what seemed a coming lecture. Why? What do you know of him? He used to be quite a big deal years back, she answered, as she swished the Chardonnay around the bottom of the glass as if divining mysteries from its depth. When I was a girl, Mom used to talk about him at the college. She was always warning Charlotte to be aware of him. Well, I would think she'd be warning him to be leery of Charlotte. He laughed as he divided a particularly tough piece of meat with his fork. Lillian ignored the verbal jab at her older sister, and she concentrated her memory. He was one of those free-love liberal types, she said, her brows knitted together in thought. He left England after his wife killed herself. This time Lillian noted the glance from her daughter, but continued nonetheless. It all looked very bad on him. She was a brilliant woman, and they all said he drove her to it. So, he never lived anywhere near Brookwood? Peter said, suddenly very interested in his wife's knowledge of events. She was silent for a moment as she leaned forward and wiped food from the baby's face with a napkin. Now that you mention it, I think there were some stories about a house out by the canal. Charlotte used to say something about there being parties out there after his wife passed away. She wouldn't go, though, since she was a fan of Petra's work. As Lillian spoke the name, Peter felt a cold chill pass over him. Petra. Petra Strauss, she reiterated as she sipped her drink. His wife was Petra Strauss. Peter's eyes grew wide as he recognized the name. Well, Petra Strauss Drescher, but all her work was published under her maiden name. Why? Didn't you know that? I should have, but I didn't make the connection, he answered as he began remembering hearing his own mother speak of her death when he was still a teenager. The girls in his class at school had all taken to carrying her books around with them, and had gathered in the library to pray for her soul the week after her death. There had been a great fear amongst the faculty that her suicide might inspire others, and counselors had been made available for months to come. So now the old bastard has turned up dead too, Lillian said with a bitter smile. Lily, I think I'm going to have to let you go shopping tomorrow by yourself, he said as he stood from the table and began to head back down the hall to his study. Oh, no, you are not, she answered defiantly. I am not doing all the Christmas myself again, Peter White. He turned and looked at her pleadingly, his mouth a thin line beneath his salt and pepper beard. Lily, I'm going to have to make a trip to Brookwood. Fine, then I'll go too. Her words were a statement of fact with no room for argument. This is police work, and it doesn't involve... Tomorrow is your day off, Peter White, and you promised to spend it with me. But the children will be more than happy to spend the day with their Aunt Charlotte. She doesn't get to see them enough outside the holidays. So she always says. I want to go to Aunt Charlotte's, Michelle said happily. There you have it. We'll have ourselves a little alone time together. Besides, I never get to do anything fun in the winter. So wandering the woods in the cold is fun, is it? He said as he shook his head sullenly. For a brief second he contemplated arguing, but the look on his wife's face was enough to silence him. Okay, but remember, when you're cold and miserable, that I tried to stop you. Oh, I'll remember, dear, don't worry. For some reason he highly doubted that it was likely that she would. They took the car and dropped the kids off at their Aunt Charlotte's before boarding a train to the next morning for Surrey. Lillian seemed delighted with the journey and was prattling on over events at work during the past week. She was a school teacher by profession, and her accounts of the misbehaviors of the students and faculty alike seemed to merge into some sort of ongoing soap opera based on the life of middle-aged teachers. Peter did not often find himself in the situation of having to engage her in such lengthy conversations, and so indulged her need to catch him up on the current events in her life. They stepped out into the station platform, and already flakes of snow were descending from the sky, above on a cold westward blowing wind. White feared that this would be the preliminary of the same storm which had left Diedrich snowbound in his apartment. They had walked into the village and found a cafe where they warmed themselves with coffee and were told that they could enter the cemetery through the station and would find the path running from the eastern side out along the canal. Lillian seemed excited and bubbly as they walked through the sea of endless graves and tombstones. Peter, on the other hand, was silent and grim as he limped along at her side, his arthritis stiffening in the cold around a gunshot wound he had received in his leg 10 years previous. She reminded him that he needed to take more exercise and once more demanded that he join her for her long summer walks. He agreed that he would, and stared ahead at the gate which lay at the bottom of a steep hill leading into a copse of snow-covered trees. They found the gate unlocked and began their hike through a now dense falling snow. It was only a half-hour long when he saw a side trail which wound up into the forest from the side of the canal. He studied the ground and noticed that there were car tracks running from the other side of the main path and up what he suspected was a driveway. "Someone's been out here," he said as they began the climb. "At least 2 vehicles, maybe vans." "But wouldn't someone know that they were here?" Lillian said, as she almost fell in a large hole hidden in a white, newly fallen powder. "I suspect that there's some place on the other side of the path which connects to the main road. Whoever's out here doesn't want anyone to know they're here. As soon as I get a good look at the house, we're headed back. This could definitely be dangerous." "Do you think this could be where the kidnappers are taking the missing people from Berlin?" Lillian was bright with interest as she trudged along in her fur-lined parka. "This whole mess is beyond me, but with poisonings and disappearances, it is surely no place for you." As they crested the hill, they received their first glimpse of a large stone wall covered in years of vines and lichen. Standing nearly 10 feet in height, they could just glimpse the roof of the house over the top. They were still a good ways from the gate, and Peter could see that clearly vehicles had entered recently. "Come on, love. Time for us to go back." Lillian nodded and smiled as they turned, but froze as she heard a rustle in the nearby bushes. "Peter, there's something over there," she whispered as she grabbed his arm. He had just begun to reach for his revolver when the dogs burst forth from the undergrowth and charged them like deadly, barking, growling missiles. And there were 4 large Dobermans with sleek black coats and vicious white fangs. The dogs fell upon them with staggering force, and with 2 for each of them now locked onto their coats, they soon were dragged to the ground. "Lily, don't fight!" Peter hissed as he gazed into the dog's unnervingly calm brown gaze. "I had no intention," she whispered back as she grew still. "They're trained guard dogs. They're only supposed to hold us." "They should be rewarded for doing such a fine job," she answered. "Nice puppy," she said in her softest schoolmother voice. "I should have brought you a biscuit from the pub." It was only a few moments before they heard footsteps in the snow on the other side of the gate, and then clanking as someone withdrew the chain. There was a loud, prolonged screech as the gate opened and 2 figures bundled from head to foot in dark winter clothes approached. The closest held a Ruger in his hand while the other called forth the dogs. "Search them," the figure holding the gun said, muffled from underneath a hood and gray scarf wrapped over the lower part of his face as he motioned for them to stand. They held up their hands as the other leaned in and began rummaging invasively through their coats. Lillian detected a foul scent emanating from the person as she watched him remove Peter's gun and wallet. "He's a cop," he yelled, with disgust and a hint of panic. "This is private property," the man with the gun said. "What business have you got snooping around here?" "Just, out for a walk," Peter answered with a nervous laugh. "Visiting some graves at the cemetery and wanted to see the countryside." "Is that so?" the man answered, his voice carrying a distinctly German accent. "Maybe you should come inside and warm up a bit then." "That's quite all right. We'll leave you be. Wouldn't want to be a bother." Peter's voice was friendly on the surface, but Lillian could hear the apprehension subtly hidden in his words. "I wouldn't dream of it," the man said as he took Peter's wallet and flicked it open, glancing within. "Inspector White. Come inside and have a drink. I feel terrible that my dogs may have caused you any inconvenience." "No harm done. We really should be going back." "I insist," the man said, still not lowering the pistol. Peter looked into his wife's terrified eyes and wished to God he had never even answered the phone when Diedrich had called. They were walked at gunpoint up the drive and then to the doors of the old, dilapidated house, which stood dark and foreboding before them. The door flew open as they climbed the steps, and a young, dark-haired girl stood on the threshold, her eyes covered in large sunglasses with a shawl draped over her head. "We have guests," the man with the gun said coldly. "I want you to go fix them some drinks, and I will meet you in the front parlor." She nodded quickly and vanished into the shadows within. The house was in no better state within than it was without. The furniture appeared to have been covered in sheets, but still held the presence of mold and mildew on the cushions and fabric. There was a huge fire burning in the hearth, but it seemed to offer no warmth in the cold, blowing draft which seeped in from every crack and crevice in the walls and floor. There was an overpowering and disturbing scent of decay hanging in the very air as they were seated by the fire. The woman returned, holding 2 wine glasses, which she gave to them with shaking hands before backing away cautiously to the door into a hall. "Drink," the man said casually as he gestured with the tip of the gun. They did as they were told, and it was only moments before they were nodding sleepily under the narcotic spell of the drug which had been administered to them. Peter had only one last glimpse of his wife as she fought to keep her half-lidded eyes from closing. He stared at her with horrible guilt and terror as unconsciousness loomed dark and heavy over him. Before his eyes finally closed, he wondered what she was staring at so intently in the far corner of the room, near the bench of an old piano. An entire day had passed since Diedrich had poured out every available drop of alcohol in his apartment. The first 12 hours had gone smoothly enough as he chewed his tablets in 2s every few hours, but by evening the urge to drink had set in with a vengeance, and he had tried to distract himself by focusing on Drescher's abhorrent video collection. But the time was now nearing midnight, and the thirst had come upon him like a plague. He had begun to sweat in frequent bursts, which soaked his clothing, and even after he removed his shirt, he still would dampen the couch where he sat. His thoughts had become disorganized and frantic as he found himself unable to concentrate for even a moment on the simplest of tasks. He hadn't eaten throughout the day, but the thought of food was repulsive, and now he was running to the bathroom periodically with bouts of painful watery diarrhea and wrenching stomach cramps. In a moment of desperation, he had went to the window to see if the street was clear. He was met by an impenetrable wall of falling snow which had gathered on his windows in a thick, solid mount. As the time neared 1 o'clock, he had taken to doing push-ups in order to try and initiate some form of endorphin release, but this too failed as his arms became too weak and unsteady to support him. By 3 o'clock, he felt as if he was going to suffocate, and he opened the windows of his apartment and stood shirtless in the freezing cold air. He felt the snow pelting his bare chest and breathed deeply as he cursed the day he had ever taken a drink to begin with. His heart was pounding a steady, angry rhythm, which he could feel as a pressure within his temples and eyes, and he wondered if he was not on the verge of a heart attack or aneurysm. He turned on the television and tried to rid himself of the nightmares he'd seen in the Drescher films. He searched early morning programming for something funny and thoughtless on which to focus, but nothing was amusing. Nothing could distract him from the need he felt in his body and mind for the blurring comfort of alcohol. Diedrich had seen addicts in advanced stages of withdrawal, and he knew the possibility of how far and how painful it could be. He had always heard stories from recovering alcoholics about the intensity of alcohol detox, but he had never taken things seriously. He remembered jokes his mother used to make about his uncle going on the wagon and seeing purple elephants. The thought of having hallucinations did not now seem like such a far-fetched or humorous notion. By early morning, his skin had begun to crawl and itch. "It's just booze," he had always thought to himself. Everybody drank all the time. Everybody sat down at a table in the beer hall for a tall brown pitcher of ale or stout. He would love a deep, black, rich stein full of bitter stout right now. He could just imagine it filling his stomach with warm comfort. But hard spirits would be better. Vodka, Now that would put an end to this misery so quickly. He was now standing in his kitchen sink, downing glass after glass of cold tap water in order to settle the intense pain in his stomach. However, nausea encompassed him, and he found himself vomiting into the sink. Good God, it's like I'm a damn drug addict. Therein lay the truth. He was an addict, and he was going through full-blown drug withdrawals. He didn't know what time it was, but now he was curled beside the toilet. He felt cold, aching, feverish. There were times when he thought he felt something crawling on his skin, and he would slap at it and then end up scratching the spot of irritation until his flesh was raw. He wondered if there were insects in the bathroom with him, and occasionally thought he saw something scurry out the corner of his eyes. His stomach hurt so intensely that he wondered if he hadn't ingested a parasite from some badly cooked meat during the week. What if there were worms crawling in his intestine? What if they had spread and were now writhing beneath his skin? He had begun to weep and pray to God to make the insanity stop. And that was when he heard a voice. Good God, Diedrich. How long have you been drinking? It was a woman's voice in the bathroom with him, but he did not open his eyes to see her. Since I was a boy, he answered through clenched teeth. How long since you have tried to go without a drink? Her voice was distant but concerned. I've lost track, but I think it may have been many years. He felt cold hands run over his sweat-soaked hair. He opened his eyes and looked at Petra as she knelt beside him. I swear to God, if I get through this, I will never drink again. That's what every alcoholic says. By the time will come when the memory of what you're enduring right now will fade, and you will think, it's been so long, I can handle it now. And that's when it will snag you again. That's the real trap of addiction, Diedrich. That you can forget the misery it caused you, and all you'll remember is how good it made you feel. She sat down beside him and rested her head on his shoulder. It's like an old lover who treated you like shit. You part ways and you say you never want to see them again. Then one day they show up and you forget what a complete mess they made of your life, and before you know it, they're back again. She leaned back against the wall, and again it seemed as if a cigarette had appeared in her hand from nowhere. You'll meet people who will say things like, I just don't understand how people can do drugs. I just don't understand the mind of an addict, or I don't comprehend how people can commit suicide. But from what I've seen, life is an addiction. Everything of the flesh can pull you in and snare you. Food, sex, power, and control. They are all illusions, and they are all addictive in their own way. You mentioned suicide, Diedrich said as he pulled himself up and stared at her with sick, morbid wonder. How is suicide an addiction? She smiled sadly as she blew smoke from her mouth like an uncoiling serpent. The thought of self-destruction becomes a passive-aggressive escape mechanism for dealing with your problems. Whenever things get bad, whenever people hurt you, or when your dreams get crushed, there is always that alternative of escape. It's like a dark, horrible fantasy that if you really want, you can just leave it all behind. You will make all those people that treated you badly regret every insult and cruel word. You will show them just how evil they are in one dramatic gesture of ultimate revenge. However, there's a catch, which is it's all an illusion. Just like the comfort at the bottom of a bottle or dripping from the end of a needle. You'll find that if you review your list of those that have hurt you, the vast majority are grossly unaware or really could care less. They don't show up at your funeral weeping at how badly they treated you. The ones that really do get hurt, the ones who do feel responsible, are usually the people who loved you and you didn't really want to hurt in the first place. Like, for instance, your children. You had 2 children, didn't you? Yes. My daughter is a model in America, and my son is a musician in Manchester. My son is a drug addict, and I think he is suicidal. I've been watching him ever since I was freed from Emmerich's hold. He is a brilliant and talented man, but he's caught in the web of despair. I left him when I died. There you go, Diedrich. I wanted to be remembered for my poetry, but instead I've left behind my misery, like a congenital illness passed to my children. That is my legacy. I wanted to make Emmerich pay for what he did to me, but I didn't realize that you cannot make a soulless monster feel regret. Instead, my vengeance missed its mark like a ricocheting bullet and planted itself squarely in the hearts of my children. Does your daughter have these problems as well? She has been married 3 times, and each time to abusive, manipulative bastards. She is a successful and beautiful woman with absolutely no control over her personal life. Yes, I think she is afflicted as well, wouldn't you say? Can they see you as I do? He was now staggering to his feet and leaning on the sink. His legs wobbled, and for a moment he thought he would collapse back onto the floor, but Petra quickly stood and moved under his arm to support him. I don't think that Karina has a psychic bone in her body, but Eric is much like his father. I think that he is most likely a very powerful psychic, but like you, he has suppressed it. Petra eased him down the hallway and led him to his bedroom. She lay him down on the bed and removed his trousers. He watched as she slipped off the black dress and crawled beside him like a long, beautiful leopard, her cold, otherworldly body a strange comfort. "Is there any way for you to help them?" he said as she nestled her head on his chest. "Perhaps, but I will need your help. However, right now, you are no help to anyone, which is unfortunate, since your friend the Englishman and his wife could use some help right now." "Peter," Dietrich said, almost bolting upright before she eased him to lie back down. "Yes, he's gotten himself into a bit of a fix. I have to do something. If anything happens to him, it will be my fault." "Look," she said, leaning on her elbow and gazing at him as if from some tragic, languid dream. "If you promise to help me, then I will help them. But what can you do?" "It doesn't matter. Just promise me, if I do, then you will help my kids. Anything. I promise." His voice was pleading and desperate. "Good. Then the first thing for you to do is to reach over to the phone on the nightstand and call the police in England. Tell them that your friend and his wife are at the house you saw in Emmerich's movies. The house is about 1.5 miles up the path that runs along the canal from the Brookwood necropolis." Dietrich did as she said. He told them that he was afraid Peter had gone out to investigate a lead on a case as a favor to him. As it turned out, Peter's sister-in-law had already called the station and reported that Peter and Lillian had had not yet returned to pick up their children at the time which they had set, and had not called to check in. After he hung up, he looked at Petra. Now, for me to help them, I will need something from you, Diedrich. Anything, he answered, as he touched her bare, ice-smooth shoulder. I will need some of your energy. As she leaned forward and kissed him, he thought of all the stories of ghosts returning from the beyond to feed on the essence of the living. He watched as, like some pale and lovely succubus, she wrapped herself around him and began to entangle him in her soft, cold presence. For better or for worse, he began to feel the symptoms of his agonizing withdrawal subside, beside the greater supernatural passion she was inspiring in his body. I don't understand, he said, as her cold body embraced him. You don't understand what? Her body was rising, descending over him now like a cool tide of longing. How I can touch you. How all of this is possible. When you dream, doesn't it all seem very real and tangible? So am I dreaming? In a way, it is like a dream that crosses over into the world like dye poured into water. But that still doesn't make any sense. Does anything? She now lay beside him for a moment, gazing up at the dark ceiling. All of the frustration and need had been calmed, and he lay silent and exhausted before her cold, still form. At last, the blurred torrent of thoughts and fluctuating emotion had ceased in the aftermath of their bonding. He turned to face her and utter the words which he had been longing to say, but she was gone. Now he felt alone, more than he ever could have imagined possible. If only he could have met her long ago, when she walked amongst the living. Maybe he could have brought her some joy to the torment of her existence. But Diedrich knew that in life Petra Strauss would have thought nothing of a man like him. He wondered if even her spirit actually felt anything akin to true caring for him, or if he were only some means by which she might correct the horrors and mistakes of her mortal life. Here he was alone in his bed, feeling as if he were being used by this beautiful ghost. He closed his eyes and found that now he could at least think clear thoughts within the silence of his mind. He tried to understand, to gain some perspective on all she had told him. Was it all true? Was he finally just now awakening to a different set of rules, a different quality of perception, which he denied throughout his entire life? He thought of her poetry and realized that she had been glimpsing these secrets while she lived. She had walked in a shadow in between the world of the living and the dead, and this had in time driven her into a bitter and vengeful darkness. Could he tread along this path as well, and still manage to exist within the world of man's ignorance unblemished? He thought of all the people he had ever met, and realized that now, in the light of his knowledge, he could see the denials and confusions of man's cursed consciousness. If all men could see the endless eternal ocean of possibility and creation, what would come of the world? How could they have allowed themselves to become so tragically distracted from such enormous cosmic truths? Men who had created such ridiculous and monstrous diversions in an effort to never have to witness the subtle and stark truths of who they were, and what would eventually have to face at their end. Men who may well convince themselves of eternal paradise as a reward for their perceived sufferings, or just as easily dismiss that any of it held any meaning at all. But what was the truth of man? How much does any of his actions and decisions really mean? Men who would tell themselves that the world was given to them as a right of their inheritance, but secretly curse their very existence as a burden to be bore and then disregarded? What if it were truly all as Petra had described, and life and identity would in time be shown as the sum total of one's own decision to survive and accept the responsibility of a soul for its own interactions?